If he can't do that, Nirmal, is there any way that he can guide to a 5% on sub 5% fiscal deficit for next year?
I think, yeah, this budget is very challenging because he has got very little leeway on the tax side and very little room also on cutting down expenditure. But I think what he can do, he can increase the excise duty and service tax by 2%. Again, he can, in service tax today, there are services which are specified which are taxed. He can do the way excise duty is levied, that all services are taxed except these exemptions, which probably can boost the revenue significantly. Today, services account for 65% of GDP, but only tax 10% of tax revenue. So I think this is one area where he'll try and get some more revenue. But given that there are inflationary pressures also, he will also look at non-tax revenue and think like there's some spectrum left with government, they can auction that. Then he can probably auction coal blocks. You know, there are some large players who are talking about that, that government probably will resort to that to raise more money. He will try and get a little more aggressive on disinvestment, although it's not easy in the current market environment, but at least he can have plans for next 12 months. So I think all these things he will do. And amnesty, I'm also doubtful, particularly now that the current Supreme Court judge is very vocal about criticism of the government. But he may do it in a roundabout way, which is something like a resurgent India bond, because government has given some cues about it that probably they're going to address this issue. So I think all these measures will be key, and FII particularly will be looking at fiscal deficit. Because if fiscal deficit goes out of control, it will spook the bond market, and that will have negative impact on equity market as well.
Raamdeo, I was coming around. Is that the central risk that on Monday you hear the FM saying next year's fiscal deficit target is 5% plus? In a scenario where the world is already worried about inflation and deficit in India, that may make investors even more nervous?
I'm reasonably sure that finance minister is not going to make that kind of statement. It's different that what will be the actual number in 11-12.
So he'll say 4.6, yeah, but he'll deliver 5.2.
He might say 4.4, 4.5, whatever pleases the market. I think that's the number you're going to hear. But whether people believe in that number or not, that's a different thing, because it all depends on the growth. Because the tax buoyancy, tax collection is a function of tax buoyancy, and buoyancy is completely a function of growth rates. Now, I think the entire economy is struggling between the inflation and growth. If you want inflation of 6% or sub 6%, and now with the extra challenge of higher oil prices, I think it becomes very difficult. And after 2 years of consecutive very high inflation, it's just a testing. I mean, it's some kind of a what do you call high resistance. I mean, tipping point kind of thing in inflation, where it can create a problem in the country. So I think they would not push their luck with the higher inflation the next year, and they would rather sacrifice some amount of growth. And the moment you sacrifice growth, you don't know what is going to be your tax collection, even at higher 2% higher service or Senvet rates. So I think it's going to be whatever they say today in calculation. It has no meaning if the oil price go to 120, 125. It will be very challenging, because the oil subsidy itself will cross 1 lakh crore.
Nilesh, what do you think? At $115 Brent, will he come out and say 4.5% fiscal deficit next year? Will he stick his neck out to that extent?
But there are two possibilities. One is to keep the entire subsidy off budget, like it was happening in 2007 and 2008, and still present a number which will be acceptable to the market.
But that cuts no ice. Everybody looks through that. Ice,
but then, you know, the finance minister should ask just one question to all these people who are raising doubts. Okay, give me what will be the projection of your crude prices. One guy will say 70, other guy will say 90, third guy will say 150. And, you know, you could then say that, okay, how will I estimate my subsidy bill? So I'm keeping oil subsidy out of the budget, and this is my core deficit. Second thing, our nominal GDP has grown by 22% plus. So your denominator has gone up, and to that extent you have the advantage of bringing in deficit on a, you know, like numerical basis below.
That's 4. Optical. It's the net borrowing which matters.
It's again optical. The third thing is that the government probably will announce about 400,000 crore of net borrowing program, which is well within the acceptation of the market. There is fair amount of interest in the minds of foreign investors about Indian bond. So if you have to raise $5-10 billion extra from FI, that's possible. If you want to raise that from RBI, that's possible. So there are enough levers which are available. One interesting observation which is there about the fiscal deficit and other things, you could either have a situation like UK, which is facing 4% inflation and 2% growth, or you could have a situation like India, which is facing 8.5% growth and 8% inflation. I think we are better off with India position rather than UK position. So we are in a soup, but we are not as bad as many of our peers, and we should be happy about it.
Ashok, the other thing which people keep talking about is GST. Is there anything which happens in this budget, or he merely says, I'll introduce the bill, we'll see in the next session of Parliament, maybe monsoon?
Well, I think, Udyan, to some extent, the Prime Minister in his interaction with the media has already indicated what is going to happen in the budget by putting the blame firmly at the doorsteps of the opposition. In a sense, he has put his hand up and said, listen, this is beyond my control. I would be surprised if there is a firm date, given that background. I would be surprised if there's a firm date given by the Finance Minister for a GST rollout. And my bigger worry is that should there be no date given now, we should be really debating on whether we will see GST during the regime of this particular government over the next 3 years. Because, 2012 is 1 year away from the last budget of this government, and, during that period, politics always overtakes economics.
And what would have changed anyway between now and then? I mean, the government has not been able to convince the opposition so far. So what changes between now and the next 6 months?
Yeah, so which is why, as I said, I don't think the government will push its credibility by putting a date out. I think there may be a broad-based statement to say that we will continue working with the opposition and try and issue a GST regulation. But it is unfortunate because to some extent, multiplicity of taxes resulting in the higher incidence of tax is responsible for some of this inflationary tendencies.
Absolutely.
And let's not forget that, when you roll out GST, it's not as if the GST effect will be seen on day one or month one or year one. There's going to be a serious amount of change in supply chain, and there will be chaos for a couple of years. So by the time you actually see the whole effect of GST built into the prices, I think it's 2 to 3 years, as has been the experience in other countries. And therefore, I'm unfortunately not expecting much on the GST front for sure.
Nirmal, is it fair to expect any cooperation from the opposition at this point from the government? An opposition which realizes it's got the government on the mat. Will it make it easy, or things like GST, or just continue to stick needles by the government side?
GST today, there was Madhya Pradesh state government budget and they oppose GST openly. So I think you can't expect much. But what Finance Minister can do, given that they've got only one more budget, they can give a roadmap of 2 to 3 years. So that the credibility is dependent on their coming back to power. And secondly, in the GST, there are only 99 items under exemption, and there are currently in the excise 300 items. So if he wants to move forward, he can prune down the list of exempt items, and which will make like one step towards GST. I think he can, maybe it'll be easier for him to move towards DTC, which is, direct tax code, where he can remove the surcharge and increase the minimum alternate tax to 20% and things like that. But I think it's very unrealistic to expect that opposition will support or cooperate, given that the political heat will build up with 5 state elections, and next year, they're planning for the central election. So I think things like this will continue. But one good thing is that government has formed JPC, which will at least allow the parliament to function, has taken away, the key contention that they had.
That's a 3-letter word, but not quite the same.
With 30 members.